Hello, welcome back to Painting with Artie Julie. Today we're going to be creating a farmyard scene like this one, and we're going to be using cling film for the walls in the background to create the effect of the brickwork and then painting back into it. Okay, let's get going. Okay, I've drawn out this little scene that we're going to work on now. I have actually used a little cheat sheet, which is the drawing's already been laid out for you on a cheat sheet. Scribble on the back, go back over the lines when you've placed it in the position that you want, and this will be available at a little bit later time on my website, artiejulie.com. Right, so now we're going to make a start on this one. So as normal, we go work from background to foreground, weekies, wetties, washes first of all. But to give you the texture for the brickwork, we're going to put some cling film onto the wet paint. So I've got some, it's just kitchen plastic wrap. Cling film is another name for it. Just make sure you've got enough to cover the area that you want to do. So you might want 2 pieces of this, so check it first. So that will cover the brickwork and the walls on there before you start. So I'm just going to put that to one side. I'm going to mix up the colours I want to use in here. And this was a Welsh farm, a little gateway where the barn was falling to pieces, and it's Welsh farm slate. So it's going to be all sorts of interesting colours. So push your colours a little bit there. We're going to use a little bit of ultramarine blue, just a bit of that on its own, blue, grey, slate colour. A bit of ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson, the pinky red, to give me a little bit of a purpley colour in there. You want a bit of ultramarine blue and burnt umber, again a bluey grey colour, because that's the colour of the slate. And also perhaps some greens in there to give you the colour where the moss is running over, and the greens are mixed with cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue. So while that's now I've mixed those up, I'm going to use my mop brush, nice big soft brush, clean water. I'm just going to wet all this background area around where the gates are. I'll go over the top here, or the doors I should say, the barn doors there. So keeping this so it's nice and glossy wet, down into the bottom here a little way, across the top. Doesn't matter if it overlaps well, just let the water overlap the barn doors slightly. I've put a couple of chickens in the front here and off the side of the paper. So that's all staying glossy wet, a little bit down into the front there. So now I can pop some colours into that. Big brush. Start with the palest colours first. So a little bit of weak blue in a few places. This is a bit of weak blue. A little bit of purpley colour. And just push the colours a little bit more than you think you want to. Just make them a bit more interesting than just boring old grey. And then a bit of the grey in there as well. And then what we're going to do is put the cling film on just to give the effect of the brickwork in a moment. Bring that up to the edges there. So it's all covered in different patches of the colour there. A little bit of green as well to make it look like it's coming up, and that can come down into the water. I've got this a bit too wet, so I'm just going to dry my brush and take some of these puddles out of it. Just a little bit here, it's a bit too wet, it's running off the paper, which is far too wet for this. So carry on now, put a bit more green in behind here, as if the moss is going up the side of the buildings. Bit of water off there, a bit more colour in, because the colour will dissipate out once you've got the cling film on there. It'll be quite subtle, so let's put a bit of extra colour into it to make it jump out the picture a bit more. And again, some stronger greys behind the barn door, into the top here, perhaps a bit stronger down this end. So you've got plenty of colour onto it. Right, now I'm going to put the cling film on, and we'll have to let it dry. So cling film is a little bit unpredictable of what it's going to do and how it's going to work. So I'll come back and do a bit more in the foreground in a moment. So the way you want to put that on is to get your cling film. You don't want to stretch it like you're going to wrap the cheese up. You just want to let it fall into its natural crinkles. So you want some crinkles on there, but don't screw it up. Just let it drop. Let's do it that way. Drop onto your paper, and you encourage it to go into little lines perhaps. As it drops down there, it will touch the surface of this paper while it's still wet and give you lots of pretty shapes there, which will look like, hopefully look like the brickwork in the walls without you having to do too much painting of individual bricks. Let's do the same on this side. Just going to drop it onto that wall, let it concertina up into little crinkles, not too much like that where it's screwed up in a little lump. You just let it drop down so it goes into its little natural crinkles, and then it will dry. You can just give it a bit of a pinch if you want a few more crinkles in, and you can just let it dry out like that. While it's drying, I'm just going to peel it back at the bottom just a little way, and I can just do a little bit more work on this bottom area. So save just putting it to one side straight away. I can just put a little bit more work down here. So while it's on there, I can just finish off with this bottom area. I'm just putting a bit of water down here underneath the chickens, just making sure we put a little bit of an undercoat perhaps onto this bottom edge here, up to the chickens. In fact, we can just let that lap into the chickens, thinking about it. It'd probably be a bit easier to do that. Off the bottom of the paper, take the puddle out of it so it's not soaking wet by drying your brush and just taking the puddles out. And we're just going to continue with those greens we've got, perhaps make them a little bit stronger and brighter into the bottom here, a little bit more yellow into that to give it a brighter green for the foreground here. It doesn't matter if it touches into the cling film a bit. This is just around the chickens there, giving the grass that they're feeding on. And off the page here, off the piece of paper, perhaps put a little hint of the pathway in as well to give it a little bit of a muddy look to it. So just clean my brush into a little bit of weak burnt sienna we've got here. Just give it a little bit of a pathway coming down. Keep it coming diagonally so it comes off the paper rather than too much towards you. Give it a bit of variation into that foreground, and perhaps even just a hint of yellow ochre to give you a bit of the straw coming out of the doorway. Now I've got to leave it all to dry. Nothing I can do with it until it's completely dry. Just take a bit of that colour out. We can't dry it with a hairdryer because it will just blow the cling film off. So now's the time to pause your video for a moment, go and have a nice cup of tea, and we'll come back in a few moments. Okay, so that should be nice and dry now. It does take a little while, so you have to have a bit of patience, and you can check it to see that it's dry by the patterning shouldn't move if you just move it slightly. So this is dry. You can see there's lovely patterns and shapes now, which will give the effect of the wall on there. But in one or two places it's a little bit damp, so now I'll dry it with a hairdryer just to make sure it's completely dried out. Okay. Okay, so that's the cling film. Okay, it's wobbled over the edges a little bit in some places, but don't worry about that too much. You can always just use a brush, wet the places, rub it with your brush here. As long as you've got good quality watercolour paper, it will just dab out again, so you can lift it out and just move that away from the edge so it's not so strong on those bits. Just dab it with a bit of tissue and most of it should come out enough that we can work back into that again. And again a little bit on this side just to make that a little bit smoother so we don't get the texture into the doors, and that should be enough for around those places. So we're going to continue into this. We're going to put some shading around the outside edges, but we can start to put a bit of colour into the inside of the barn here, and perhaps just a little bit of colouring around the doors themselves, just giving this extra time to dry. So let's just start working around here. We can put a little bit of grey wash straight over these doors, just onto dry paper. If you paint in the direction of the doors, it will, if there are any little streaks because you're putting it onto dry paper, it doesn't really matter. So that's one door. We will come back and put a little bit of detail onto it. This is another door coming down here. This is just ultramarine blue and a touch of burnt umber to give you this grey look to it. Again, it's the same sort of colours we've been putting in before. And if you can put a little bit of the same background colours, perhaps a stripe or two of the purpley colours into it, it will just add a bit more interest. Then back to the grey. We could even put a bit of the green for the moss coming up the door in a moment, but it should look different to the texture you've got on your background. A bit more purpley colour, and then a bit more ultramarine blue, burnt umber. Always mix more paint up than you think you're going to need, because you don't want to mix it as I'm doing while you're waiting for something while it's drying out on your paper. So just let me blend those in a bit more. I'm deliberately making it look stripy, so it's going vertically stripy, so it looks a bit more like the panels, and the odd streak of moss or greenery to make it look a bit older and more dishevelled in there. So again, a bit of that colour across the top for the beam going across the top here, which is supporting these barn doors and the opening itself there. Just keep that going in the direction of the beam. The same, we will come back and put some more detail into it, but that's just putting the colouring onto there to start with. Quite fancy having a bit of green in that side as well to match. So just letting that part dry there. We'll put a little bit of colour into this background area. First thing we need to do is put the palest colours in first, so I think we're going to put the straw in with a bit of yellow ochre. This is, let's find a little puddle to mix up here, or raw sienna, either will do for this one. So I'm mixing a puddle of that first. So it is just the undercoat first of all. We'll come back and do some other colours with it on top, put the details in. So just straight on top of that, a little bit of yellow ochre, just putting the straw coming in. It's tumbling down from the little bales there and blending in with the foreground behind the little chickens there. And then there's a rusty farm implement in the background, so a little bit of burnt sienna into that to start with, and then we can come back again. Watercolours don't work until, or don't come together until you come back to put the final details into that. So those are the first few bits of colour onto those. So while we're waiting for those bits to dry, we can actually start to do a bit of work on the chickens as well, because we'll put a bit of more background into it, but we might as well start working with the chickens there. Chickens are great fun to do. They're such lovely colours into them. So we're going to start off with a bit of yellow ochre or raw sienna, a bit of burnt sienna for a reddish brown, making these a bit stronger now. They're quite a dark tone, almost some of them have got bluey feathers into it, so I'm mixing up an ultramarine blue and burnt umber to put the darker shadows underneath them. And I'm going to have a bit of blue, bright blue or greeny colour if you want to. I'm having a bit of blue colours for the tail feathers on there to give it a bit more interest from the background, and then you get the heads with a little bit of very bright cadmium red or orangey red of some sort, perhaps vermilion, but nice bright orangey red. So I'm just putting a bit of water onto my palette for that one. So let's start doing a little chicken. This is all nice and dry around there, so it won't run into the background. So we'll start off with the little bit of the neck, which is just straight onto the dry paper. Let's put that somewhere else in the body for a few more bits of the feathers. Clean the brush into a bit of stronger burnt sienna, put a bit of that on so it blends into that a little way, blends into that a bit. Clean the brush into the stronger bluey colour, just add a bit of life to it. Just onto the dry paper. We can flick out the tail feathers from the back here. And then some of the darker colours, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, just add a bit of that in as well, a little bit underneath to give it the shape. Make it a bit more rounded. It's a bit of a skinny chicken, that one was. And then we can just pop on perhaps his little legs. You won't need to put too much for the legs. Just let that run down, just a couple of little streaks for the legs, a couple of dots for the feet going out sideways. Nice bright tiny bit of red here. Just dot on a little circle for the red, a little bit down the front there. I'm just going to let that dry before I stick the beak on it, because otherwise it will just run into the background. And again, just a little bit of, perhaps a bit of bluey green, just dot out a bit of shadows underneath them, or him anyway. So he must be the cockerel there, so just put a shadow underneath that one. Let's move on to another one while that one's drying, so we can do this one over here. Same sort of thing, start with your palest colours first, just onto the dry paper. A little bit of the yellow ochre while it's on the brush. And then a bit of the burnt sienna. Touch that in some places. Just let it sit there, little bits of puddles. Bit of the ultramarine blue, give them a bit of brighter colouring into that. I think in one of my next videos I'm going to show you how to just simply draw farmyard animals. Just a nice simple shapes. You have to look at the simple shapes for them, but we'll just go through and do a few of those at some point in the future. Okay, and then a little bit of the dark underneath there to give him the shape. That's the ultramarine blue and burnt umber. A couple of streaks of that. And again, a little bit of the red on the top. We'll have this one looking towards you, so not so wide with the red on there. Again, just let that dry before we do the little details onto him with the beaks and things. So have this one bending down here. Yellow ochre on the back. A little bit more of the burnt sienna, a stronger reddish brown colour. And then some nice bright blue colour to give them a bit of lift in the picture. Again, just straight up round the tail, give them the fancy tails that they've got down here. I'm sure somebody will know the breed of chicken that this is, but I don't, I'm afraid, not that up at my chickens. And then a little bit of dark underneath there to give him the shape. I forgot to put his legs on. Let's put a couple of legs coming forwards. And again, a little bit of red around the top here. Just dot that on. That's a bit of a grubby brush. It's a brighter red around there. So I'll just go back. I'll just get a smaller brush now just to put the little beaks and eyes on. I think that one should be dry enough now. If not, what we can do is just put a little bit more. This one's just having a little bit of a bluey green or bluey grey shadow just underneath. Not too far away. Just keep that shadow as a little horizontal line. Same with this one, little bluey grey shadow, just not too strong with that. Seat them down. And then the beaks themselves, stronger. I'll just use a sort of browny colour for those. Little tiny beak, don't make too much of it. Little tiny beak. And then a tiny weeny strong dark dot for the eye. Strong dark dot for the eye. So now we've been doing those, the rest of this area should be nice and dry, so we can start to build up a bit more depth and some of the shadows and some of the details into the background there. We're going to get a strong bluey grey colour, ultramarine blue and a touch of burnt umber. We need to put some more details into the background and just put the details and the shadows in around these. So we'll start off, we'll just do a first wash into this background onto dry paper of this area behind the farm implements in here. And all you can do with that is a bit of ultramarine blue and burnt umber, big brush. This you'll probably find we'll need 2 coats to make it strong enough and dark enough. So as you know with watercolours, you have to let one dry before you can put the next one on. So we're just putting that first coat on here at the moment, and then we can go and do some other details. Just always paint with a puddle of paint, otherwise it will go streaky. And we can let that dry and then come back and give it another coat. But it should get the depth into the picture. Let's just make that a little bit more uneven at the top of there because it's straw. We don't want a dead straight line across the back there. Then up around whatever this piece of farmyard equipment is here. That's putting the depth into the background there. Dry your brush and take out any little puddles that you've got. We can come back and give that another coat to make it darker in a moment. So while that's drying, what we can do is, now this is completely dry, we can put the shadows behind the door a little way just to make that stand out a bit, because they are blending in a bit. So the same colour again, make sure you've got your colour mixed up, ready and waiting. A stronger ultramarine blue, touch of burnt umber, make it a bluey grey colour, nice and strong. And so just around the background here, clean water mop brush, we're just going to flick on a little bit of water. We don't want to rub it too much because otherwise it will lift that lovely patterning we've got on there. Do the same on this side as well. Just flick on a bit of water. And then smaller brush, we'll just touch in some of this dark shadow. Don't rub it, or otherwise, as I said, you'll lose that nice bit of cling film you've gone to all that trouble of working on. But you can see that will just bring the edge of that doorway out, and then we'll just let it settle back into that water that we've put on there. Let's take the puddle out, a little bit too wet on that. Just dab that a little there. And I'm just going to take that just underneath here, just so the shadow comes behind and underneath the door. It's the same with this one. I've just already wet that, so it's just coming up. Should have just wet one side at a time, but and then put the shadows into it. Just take it backwards and forwards slightly. Don't rub it, otherwise you'll lose the patterning. But this will just, oh, I've just put my finger in that wet bit there, so it's, we've got a little patch in there, but it's a good job. We're going to give that another coat in a moment. And again, just bring it up behind that door, and just a little bit under the door. Try and neaten that up. So that's giving me the shadows behind the door there. We can now carry on and do little bits of detail onto the door itself because that's dry. Small brush, we're just going to paint on some of the texture of the barn doors here. This is the little bits of the grain that's going across the top of this lintel, and perhaps even onto this dry paper at the top here. We can just emphasise some of the shapes of the little cracks in the brickwork, make them a little bit more pronounced. Small brush, ultramarine blue and burnt umber, and we're just putting a hint of brick in there, just following some of the abstract shapes that the cling film's made for us and just enhancing that a little way. You don't have to do it all the way across. The further away you get from the centre of interest here, the weaker that you want this colour, so it takes the eye off, or brings it in, I should say, into the centre of the picture with the stronger tones. I'm just going to put a little bit more under that to make it look like the cracks in the brickwork, as if the brickwork's sitting in behind the lintel. A bit more dark around there. We need to do the same down the sides here, but we'll just wait for that shadow to dry. So while that's drying, I'll just put a little bit of shadow underneath that lintel. We can go into some of the details of the door itself. I'm just bringing a bit across the shadows across that one. So door and this background area here, the straw we can just do with a little bit of weak burnt umber and just put some little bits of effects of the straw just tumbling down, a little bit dark at the bottom there, and again some little bits here to make it look like the bales of hay falling out of the open doorway. I got this idea from a little photograph I took when I was in Wales. There's a lot of lovely ramshackle old buildings and things there, which are just great for painting. And it's just quite an effective way of bringing up a simple shape which people just walk past without even noticing, and it could be quite a nice little scene really. So a little bit of the stronger ultramarine blue and burnt umber in places, just give that a bit more detail. This wall's probably nice and dry now, so I can continue to do the cracks in that one. Ultramarine blue burnt umber mix. Again, we'll just put some little hint of brickwork coming across the side here into some of those bits there. Just fools the eye into thinking that you've done an awful lot of work with this, and you haven't really. Just a few little bits. So those should be fairly dry, so I can start to put the details onto the door. And again, we just want some of the shadows where the, oh, it's a bit more blue into that. Just perhaps under some of the supporting panels, a few little bits coming down. I should really turn this round so I can do it at a better angle, but we'll keep going like this at the moment. Just putting in a hint of some of these cross beams. You don't have to do them all, just a few. Surprising what the eye makes up. Just a little bit of the greys there, and a little bit of definition between that door and the bottom and behind the scenes there. And it's the same on this one. It is just a few bits with ultramarine blue, burnt umber, smallish brush. Just mix a bit of that paint up to do perhaps the joint down the door. Perhaps a little bit of this where it's going into that brickwork. A few hint of these bits coming across, just flick those in, flick them across. You don't want to put too many dead straight lines on it, which is very lucky because I'm not very good at drawing very accurate lines across there. So it's just a flick, just to give you the hint of where the structure is, and then a few bits of the beams coming down in between, or not the beams, the panels I should say, coming down in between there. And a few bits of these coming down, so where those are coming down, just make sure that they come through. The little joints in between the panels. Again, just some more there. By the time we've done those, this background should be pretty well dry, so we can just put in, as we did at the top here, just a hint of some of the little bricks and boulders and things that have gone together to make those very nice walls here. And so you don't need too much of them. Let the cling film do the work for you, so you are just tickling in a few bits and not too much detail with them. They're not perfect little bricks, they're odd shaped ones, they're all different sizes. As you come away from the picture, just get that almost like grubby water. You don't want it too strong. The same on this side. A few enhance that. Let me just try and get around the other angle of that. Still a little bit damp, but I'll try and get a little bit on there. Should all be onto dry paper now, so there's one or two more over this side. Just all helps to lead the eye into the picture and just fool your brain into thinking all that work that you've done with the cling film, you've painted on every little bit separately. Right, I'm just going to mix up just the last little bits of dark to put into the centre here, and we're nearly done. Nice big puddle of strong ultramarine blue, burnt umber, making sure this is dry now. It should be dry there, so a little bit stronger with that paint mix, a little bit more of it because I don't want to run out halfway through like I did last time. Now I'm just going to load the brush, start at the top and just work back over that. So I haven't wet it. It's just, as long as you keep your brush loaded with paint and work across and don't rub it backwards and forwards, it will sit on top of the last layer and just go a darker, stronger colour, which will give you some depth into your picture there. If it's not completely dry, what will happen is the bottom part will start to lift again and it will go patchy and you won't be able to get it dark enough. So I could have given it a blast with a hairdryer then to make sure it was dry, but it should be all right. And that's really starting to come together now. I'm just going to use this same colour, this very dark, just to put a bit of shaping into the whatever this thing is here. I'm not very good with my farm implements. A bit of something in the background. Maybe I'm just going to put a little bit of a weaker grey just around there. Just let it run under the corner there, and a spot of water on just to blend it away. Pretty well done. Nearly there. Just want to make sure that the chickens are all right and they look like they're in the picture. So some of these shadows look a little bit strange, so we'll just put a little bit more shadows coming across, just with a weak greeny colour. Ultramarine blue, burnt umber, ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow to give you a green. So otherwise they look a little bit strange. So just get some variation into that shadows. A little bit across there, and we could even just flick on a little bit of colour for a bit of interest. If you just get one of the colours you've been using, perhaps the burnt sienna, and just flick it on, it'll make it look like, or even a bit of the green and things like that onto there. Just gives it a bit of interest into your foreground, really, just gently flicking it on there, and that's it. If you want to have the instruction sheets for this, or the cheat sheet as I call them, do look on the website artyjulie.com. Thank you.